Every time America has had a panic in the past, it has paid people to buy stock in the midst of the excitement. I am absolutely confident that stock purchased during this panic will also yield very generous profits.
Have you seen the well-to-do up on Lenox
Ken
Avenue?
Smith, haven't you been able to secure work lately?
With her noses in the air.
Are you able to do your work?
White fat, $15.
What are you doing? Your work.
We are not on a masquerade, but simply manifesting that there are other people, the other half, that are without the bare necessities of life while you enjoy the luxury.
Banks by the hundreds, by the thousands.
That's where each and every Lulu Bell goes. Every Thursday evening with her swell bows. Rubbing elbows, come with me and
All
we'll
of you
attend their
have
jubilee and see them spend
either
their
a job or have the possibility of buying a job or are on the job earning money and spending of it.
They're striking because the officials called a strike off. It's not a rank and file strike.
These men are without employment. They need to be employed. That is the solution of that problem as regards unemployment.
We're on strike. We want to make a living. Nobody knows the exact figure how much there are, but there are over 60,000 real voices. There are not more than 8 or 10,000 at most.
The stock market crash was still very new to the American public. Nearly 3 months had gone by. America was in a complete financial crisis. The record industry was in one too. Before October of 29, people were in relatively loose with their spending money. People could buy records from whoever, whenever. With that money now gone, people weren't buying any. Those lucky enough to still have a phonograph and records were stuck with them. Those who could still buy records were mainly buying them from the big 3 labels, Victor, Columbia, and Brunswick. The smaller labels that weren't connected to those 3 labels were either fading away, gone, or part of the ARC. The ARC had its own problems. If you weren't selling enough records or otherwise, they could disband the label. Since the short time Perfect had been there, Lincoln, Challenge, and everything else in Pathé had met their fate. Perfect was alone, that along with all the other ARC labels. Also with the ARC, new labels would sometimes share their masters with one another. In a sense, some songs would be reissued on other labels. This had happened back in the 1920s, but not to this extent. Perfect was on thin ice, so they, along with the others that year, came up with the conclusion of either go cheap or get out, which meant you had to record and release a lot more records than they had been before. That and produce the records with less shellac and sometimes poorer sound quality. Also, the ARC raised Perfect's release prices to around 25 cents. Perfect made a visual change to their label at the very start of the year on the 12500 series. It was an updated version of the now standard design, a complete black fade, a bold font added to the word Perfect, and it was this time that you start seeing at the bottom near the border a small notice saying that they were a product of the ARC. You would see this design on nearly all releases from here on out, sometimes with the blue fade. The 11000 series would be the first to start recording that year, also the first to stop recording that year, with only 6 releases made, all by Royce Mech's trio. The reason this series was discontinued is because of Diva being disbanded by the ARC around the same time. The Race series would be brought back after 2 years of dormancy, with both new artists and some other labels' artists, including Kid Williams, the famous Hoka Boys, Georgia Tom, Big Bill Brunzi, and Hannah May, and more. And lastly, the 15000 series was to start producing again. They gained the Dorsey brothers, Vincent Lopez, Burt Lone's Biltmore Orchestra, the Clevelanders, and Carl Radlatch and Cab Calloway, to name a few. The main reason they were getting so many new artists was because the ARC was getting rid of other labels, including the majority of the entire Cameo Record Company and parts of the Plaza Music Company. Basically, all the other labels, apart from Perfect, had been threats to outdo Perfect. With them gone, things were definitely easier, but it was still the ARC hinting that they could be next. Though the ARC was not particularly an evil entity, it was just a force to be reckoned with. With the Depression in full swing, they went to drastic measures to stay alive. Everyone did. Not even Victor was innocent, but that's the story for another time. And thus, Perfect closed its first year without Pathé. In the very beginning of the year, Domino would be disbanded. They would be brought back for a short time in 1932, for a year, but nothing really came of that. The race series would have no new noticeable artist or anything happen to it this year. The 11,000 came back again with Roy Smeck. Eddie Peabody would get one release on here, but other than that, this would be basically Roy Smeck's series. The Star Series, or now known as the 11,5000, came back briefly. It had been discontinued back in 27, but came back briefly, producing a few records by Lou White and Frank Munn. This would last the entire month of January before being discontinued again for the final time. The 12,500 added artists such as Josh White, Chick Bullock, Mildred Hunt, Gus Van, Gene Autry, Dick Robertson, Billy Murray, Bruce Edding, Red Pepper Sam, and even Morton Downey. And in February, Jewel would be shut down because of lack of sales and new releases being made. In May, Supertone would be discontinued. The following month, the first dime store label ever, Regal, would be discontinued too. Most of their artists were transferred to Perfect, were given to the 15,000 series. That included Eddie Kirkby and his orchestra, Vincent Rose, and Ted Black. Because of this, the 15,000 series ended and the 15,500 began that July. Artists such as Bob Herring, Dan Ritchie and his orchestra, Merle Johnson, Glenn Cross, Smith's Value, and Bob Cutler and his orchestra joined. This year started out with a monumental change. This year the Big Three would suffer greatly, the Big Three being Victor, Columbia, and Brunswick. Brunswick had the worst of it. See, in the year prior, they sold their operations to Warner Brothers, but because of the Depression hitting them so hard, they sold all of Brunswick to the ARC. So now the one corporation who had the say over who produces records and who closes their doors for good now had the choice for one of the biggest names in the industry. But the reason they got to stay up and running was because they were one of the biggest names in the industry. Though they were not having great record sales, they were still pumping out hits, almost as many as Victor was. The label that was failing the worst on the charts was actually Columbia, but we'll get back to Columbia later. The 12,500 would gain the Carolina Ramblers string band, Tom Ashley, Johnny Marvin, and Chubby Parker. The 15,500 gained Billy Banks and his Rhythm Makers, Will Osborne and his orchestra, and the Dixie Syncopators. And lastly, the Race Series gained many future famous singers that would be essential for many collectors, the majority of which came from the recently closed down Paramount Records in Wisconsin. Artists like Memphis Minnie, Tampa Red, Leroy Carr, Buddy Moss, and the Alabama Rascals are just a few examples. A few days later, the stock market would crash again, worse than 1929. Then there was a glimmer of hope for Perfect. In the middle of the year, Bruce Edding scored a hit with two songs, I'll Never Be the Same and It Was So Beautiful, both on the same records, and also both were on Perfect. But this also brings up a problem. See, back in the 20s, when Perfect got a hit, it would be exclusive to Perfect and Pathé. Now that Perfect was part of the ARC, they would share each other's masters from time to time. So the same songs would be made for the other label. The ARC could have implemented this for the purpose of not having to shut down other labels. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this song was also on other ARC labels like Mellotone, Conqueror, and even non-ARC labels like Imperial. In cases like these, it's hard to know who had the hit first, but in this case, Perfect had it first. Hits like these I will refer to as shared hits from here on out. So 32 closed and 1933 opened. By this time, the ARC was entering the 5th year of its operation. They had weeded out all the labels that they had deemed unfit to continue or otherwise. So now there was a downtime between discontinuing labels. This wouldn't last forever, but this would last throughout the year. Fresh off the bat, they started recording again. For the race series, this would be their best year to date. The other years, they would just release for a few months of the year. But now they started releasing for most, if not the full year. They gained people such as Curly Weaver, Walter Rowland, the Jack Kelly Jug Band, Bessie Jackson, and the Garland Jubilee Singers, while the 15500 had Harold White in his orchestra, Freddie Martin's orchestra, Victor Young under the alias of Phil Romano, Maple City 4, Joe Hames and his orchestra, and Gene Cardos. And lastly, the 12500 series. They got Thor Lehman, James Roberts, Mac and Bob, Parker and Dodd, Tex Ritter, Jimmy Long, Red Foley, Fiddlin' Doc Roberts Trio, but most importantly, Dick Powell. During the middle of the year, Perfect switched their recording style from Pathé's old electric style to a new style they called electrographic. Their quality only increased from there. The reason why Dick Powell was so important was because of a little movie called The Gold Diggers of 1933. This movie would have Dick in the cast. He had a few good songs in there too. But more importantly than that, it produced a small hit song called The Gold Diggers Song, or commonly referred to as We're in the Money, which is the Great Depression essential piece. This song would be made by many different bands on the ARC labels like Mellotone, Edison Bell, Brunswick, and more, but only 2 versions actually reached the charts. Ted Lewis's Columbia version for 7 weeks, and Dick Powell's Perfect version for 1 week. This would be Perfect's only hit this year, but it was undoubtedly theirs. Dick's version wasn't on any other label. Before the year was over, they released a few new sleeves to replace the old sleeves. They advertised the most popular artists including Cab Calloway, Annette Hanshaw, Will Osborne, Ruth Edding, Singing Sam, and more.
The silver dollar has returned to the home.
If things in the record industry wasn't complicated enough, this year everything was about to become a lot more complicated. Though the worst of the Depression was over, the record industry hadn't recovered too greatly. Columbia had a ton of problems financially, and the company that had saved it from certain deaths finally died off, leaving Columbia to be bought off by the ARC. So now, of the big 3, Victor was the only label not owned by the ARC. Victor was charting quite well, so was Brunswick, but Columbia would start to fade from the charts after this year. You know, also with Brunswick, an executive named Jack Kapp left his job. We'll talk more about him in a bit. With Perfect, the 12500 would record first with only a few new artists because within the first few months of the year, the series closed down. The only person of note was Elton Britt. Thus, the 1300 series began. This one was important because it had a whole new label design. Gone was the arbel, the woman kneeling, the elegant Greek design, and replaced with this now dull, bland, blue and white label with no real design. It was clearly inspired by Mellotone's label design. Above the name was the word saying full range recording, which everyone was, but there's not much to say about that. This would slowly start to become the main label design, which is sad because one of the things that made Perfect so unique was that their design was not like any other label out there. No other label had such an elegant label design. At least not anymore. Conqueror was a competitor for that, but they gave up their design years ago too. The 13,000 added the Westerners, Nick Lucas, Blake Howard, Ray Whitley, and for a short time, Cliff Edwards started recording again. Many other smaller artists recorded and released records that year. But in August, the ARC started making Brunswick share some of its masters. So different ARC labels like Perfect started releasing records by the Mills Brothers, Bing Crosby, Jack Parker, and some lesser known artists. The 15500 was also nearing its way out like the 12500 did earlier that year. So they decided to make the 16,000 series before the 15500 ended officially. For the most part, they just filled up the rest of the 15500 with Brunswick Masters by Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians. The race series would add Michelle's Christian Singers, Leadbelly, and Huddy Ledbetter. And lastly, the 16,000 had Norman Cloutier's Merry Madcaps, Blanche Calloway and her orchestra, Mal Hallett and his orchestra, Russ Morgan, and even Henry Bussey. And as far as hits were concerned, Perfect had some shared hits with the Mills Brothers, Guy Lombardo, and Freddie Martin. But Perfect also had one exclusive hit for this year too. It was by Will Osborne, Cocktails for Two. It charted number 15 for 2 weeks. One shared hit that we can confirm was Perfect was by Henry Bussey, named Hot Lips. The song charted for 11 weeks, making it Perfect's biggest hit. The label they shared this hit with was a brand new label, well, at least brand new to America. The label was Decca Records. And you know that Jack Cap guy I talked about earlier? He made it in America. Decca this year was already part of the Big Three, which is now the Big Four. This year was the first year since 1922 that there was only 2 main series that Perfect was releasing on. There was the race series, but by that April, it only had Lead Billy, Pinewood Tom, and Josh White still recording on there. Its last release is believed to be somewhere around 335. 335 releases in nearly 10 years of being a series. The 16,000 was the first to start recording again in mid-January with new artists such as Henry Allen and his orchestra, Louis Russell and his orchestra, Taft Jordan and the Mob, Teddy Hill, the Carter Family, Coon Creek Girls, and Clyde McCoy. The 13,000 started recording and gained to the roster Jimmy and Eddie Dean, Floyd Carter, the Texas Drifter, Pie Plant Pete, and Billy Costello. Then in June, both the 13 and 16,000 were both stopped because the ARC made a new system for numbering the issues on labels. Instead of just labeling it by the old way, take the 16,000. For other labels, this would mean that the record released from the 16,000 was that number's release. But this didn't work for Perfect and a few others since they didn't start at 001. With this new system, it would be 3 numbers separated by dashes. The first one meant the year, the second meant the month, and the third indicated that it was that release for that month. So for the rest of the year and forward, we will not talk about the series because on Perfect they are no more. Also because it's kind of tedious. Other recording artists this year includes Gil Rodin, Rube Bloom, Burt Block and his orchestra, and Patsy Montana with her Prairie Ramblers. Perfect would have a couple shared hits this year, one with the Carter Family called Can the Circle Be Unbroken that charted for 1 week at number 17. Perfect was also the first label to have that song released. Then one by Patsy Montana called I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart that charted for 4 weeks at number 10. And lastly, a Smith's Value hit named Roll Along Prairie Moon, which was number 4 on the new radio program called Hit Parade. And it's this point where our knowledge of Perfect starts to dwindle, mostly because there is so much information that hasn't yet surfaced. The only new artists that we know of include the Happy Valley Family, Blind Gary Davis, Jack Shilkret and his orchestra, Charles Burnett and his orchestra, the Callahan Brothers, Sam Montgomery, and Ike Cargill. Something that we also know is July was one of the more simplistic label was to take over from the old label that made Perfect stand out. There would also be no known hits this year by or shared on Perfect. This year, some important things happened. Starting off with the ARC getting around to finally legally trademarking the label. Previously, the last time the label had been trademarked was back when Pathé still owned it. Remarkably, nothing had really happened because of the lack of trademarking. They put in the appeal early that year, but they would have to wait a while before the trademark would actually be registered. The second important thing was that Perfect got its last new sleeve design. This one was a simple design surrounding the P and looping around the outside where the cutout of the label itself would be. Above the cutout was the new design of the word Perfect. Then at the bottom was a disclaimer saying that it was a product of the ARC, and on the left was a picture of people dancing. And speaking of the ARC, the downtime of assured safety had lifted. In May, the label Master went under and perished. This year there would be some important artists added alongside the usual unimportant new ones. Al Dexter, the Blue Ridge Playboys, Bernie Cummins, Larry Kent, and Sammy Kaye. But the most important artist would be the legendary Robert Johnson. This guy is the main reason why this label is known to collectors. This, at the time, 26-year-old black man from Mississippi was legendary because of the mystery surrounding him. He was a small-town kid who was bad at guitar. After running away from his town, he came back months later and played like no one else had ever seen. He played the blues, which was back then, like many harmless things, associated with the devil. So a legend formed that he had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the ability to play the guitar like no one else. The legend was partially reinforced by some of his songs like Crossroad Blues and Hellhound on My Trails. Previously, he had been on Vocalion. He only recorded a few records on Perfect before returning to Vocalion. But those records on Perfect are some of the rarest and most sought-after records that collectors never pass up. For hits, they got a shared hit, one in which Vocalion had the majority of success. Sammy Kaye's song, Rosalie, that charted for 15 weeks, but Vocalion got the record 2 months ahead of Perfect. 1938 is when everything went downhill, and fast. In the first months, the ARC suddenly started discontinuing all of the labels they owned. First came Conqueror, then OK, then Vocalion, then Columbia, Brunswick, Mellotone, Romeo, Banner, and then lastly, in April, Perfect. Only a few artists were even pressed that year. Isham Jones, Blind Boy Feeler, Joel Shaw, and lastly, the Anglin Twins. The Anglin Twins made what is most likely the last Perfect record, Don't Say Goodbye When You Go, that April. It is unknown why the ARC did this move. The info we have on the ARC is extremely scarce. They had many times said that Perfect was their main label in the late 1930s. The ARC did not last much longer themselves. All they had left was the UHCA label owned by the Commodore Music Shop, and smaller scattered labels, and the tiny self-label named American Record Corporation, that the only thing that we know about it is that it existed. We don't even know what it looked like. Near the end of the year, the remains of the ARC was bought out by Consolidated Films. Columbia's record label would be saved by the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS. CBS would in turn buy out OK, Vocalion, and Brunswick. OK would go to Columbia as a sub-label, but wouldn't see much use until around 43. Brunswick and Vocalion would eventually end up finding their way to Decca in 1940. Robert Johnson would die a relatively unknown death in August of 1938, adding fuel to his legend of selling his soul. Sammy Kaye would end up having one of the most popular and successful swing orchestras of the 1940s. Cliff Edwards, who had been Perfect's only taste of success on the charts in the 1920s, would go on to have a great career in the film industry, starring in films like Gone with the Wind in 1939 and Walt Disney's Pinocchio in 1940. He is also credited for being why the ukulele became so popular in America. Dick Powell would go on to star in many other films such as 42nd Street, The Gold Diggers of 1935, and would even be in a noir film in 1944 called Murder My Sweet, where he would gain the name as Tough Guy. He never had any more than 5 song hits though. Both Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington would prevail throughout the 1940s. Perfect never really did anything for them of note, since they were both mainly paired with Brunswick. The Anglin twins, who only had 1 record for Perfect, had 3 other records, all on Vocalion. Some like to say that the Perfect release was a hit, but the charts disagree. That's only 7 of the artists that were on Perfect. There were countless artists that recorded on Perfect. The ones that I told you about and listed were only a fraction of the entire roster. The roster from 1922 to 1938 was only around 5,000 releases too. Don't sound like much, but many of the artists I named only recorded a few records a year. For Perfect itself, there would be a small attempt to bring back the label, but only 2 records came out of that in 1940, both public domain records with green labels and a simple font. In 1939, the label's trademark would be registered, but by that point the label had been gone for over a year. Well, Perfect was far from perfect. It had many troubles and obstacles. It had a flawed career too. The whole reason why it was made was because a small French label was trying to save itself from going under. Perfect would last a lot longer than that label Pathé, and became one of the best ARC labels ever. Whenever a collector thinks about a small label or a dime store label, they think of Perfect. And they know they're in the right place when they see the brown shellac Perfect sticking out, many of which labels would fade away over time. There were some Perfect releases that became essentials for the Great Depression too. But Perfect, along with many other great things, faded away from memory. A long time later, someone would make a Perfect 45 by the band called Taste. But nothing is known about that though. But Perfect was gone, never to return. Until... There was a young college kid named Dean Blackwood who was working at a branch of the Sub Pop label while attending law school in Yale. He always had a love for 78s. He had a thing for the smaller labels too. The label Sub Pop had just gained a lot of money, more money than they actually needed too. Dean decided that because of this he would revive the Perfect label. How he did this is unknown. How he even got a hold of Perfect's recording assets of the label stamps is tragically unknown. Perhaps Sub Pop somehow obtained them over the years. We can't know for sure. Anyways, he along with an audio engineer and friend Scott Colburn started the label back up. They did not record many records. They only released around 10 records, all on vinyl 78 RPMs. They recorded raw and experimental music, some by former rockabilly artists from the 50s and 60s, some from present-day experimental bands. They would travel by car with the equipment and record in the artists' houses, hotel rooms, and other places. They recorded off and on until around 1997. Their total roster included the Sun City Girls, Charlie Feathers, Junior Kimbrough, the Balfour Brothers, and John Fahey. John Fahey, whose recording career had been put on hold a while because of alcoholism, had recorded a 78 album of 2 records, all 4 songs experimental. He would go on to purposely scratch and scuff up the copies that he had and then place them into 78 bins of record stores and thrift stores for the purpose of confusing collectors. Some people have found copies of them since then. Dean and Scott would end up stopping Perfect for the final time later that year. Dean and John Fahey would end up making their own label named Revenant Records, which had been an idea of Fahey's since 1995. The label has been inactive since 2015. This small resurgence of Perfect is widely unknown about. I tried to get as much info as I could on it. I even tried to contact Dean himself, but my efforts were fruitless. I guess some things are supposed to stay mysterious, just like the rest of Perfect. We don't know anyone who worked at Perfect, or why the series started out of order, or even why Perfect was struck down by the ARC. They never really had any big hits. They had the cards stacked against them the whole time. But still, they became the best and most iconic dime store label. So when you come across a Perfect record, make sure to at least get one, because you're helping to preserve one of the most fascinating stories of the 78 era.
My fleeting moment of tenderness, I sang of true love, I played guitar, then I found new love neath tropical stars. This time's the last time, this time it's new.